As you mentioned, originally I'm from Israel, from Jerusalem. I come from a very patriotic Zionist Israeli family. And over the last 15, 16 years, I've embarked on a journey which I call the journey of an Israeli into Palestine, which is also the subtitle of my book, The General Son. And when people ask me, why am I an advocate for Palestinian rights suddenly? Why am I speaking on this issue? Why did I become an activist? My answer is that I met Palestinians. And it's not a very long journey geographically, because Israel and Palestine, first of all, is the same place, but it's a very small place. So to take the journey from the sphere that I grew up in as an Israeli, which is privileged and clean and safe, to the sphere where Palestinians live, which is the sphere of the oppressed, that provides no safety, no security, is geographically, again, it's not very far, it's not very long, but it's a huge leap mentally, emotionally. It's a huge journey. Most Israelis would never make it. They never do.
What inspired you to write a book, and what was your writing process like?
What inspired me to write a book was several people, friends, who told me that there's a story that needs to be written, that the story that I present, the story that is my family and my life, and is something that should be written. And at one point, a particular friend said, "You got to do it. You got to do it now." And then I sat down and started writing. I didn't really know what I was going to write. I didn't think it was going to be personal at all. I thought it was just going to be like about the politics. But eventually that changed, and it became, memoir. For me, it was a very rewarding process. And the second edition just came out. In other words, the book just came out in second edition, and there's a very long epilogue which describes how the journey continued since the book has been out, which is the past 4 years.
In your view, what's the main issue in Israel-Palestine? How would you encapsulate it? On your blog, you talk about tearing down the separation wall and transforming Israel into a secular democracy. Could you explain more?
Yeah, the problem is Israel. The problem is that Palestine has been occupied for 7 decades, and the state of Israel was established on occupied Palestine. And it created a regime that has been engaged in genocide for 7 decades. It has policies of ethnic cleansing and laws that are apartheid laws. That is the problem. The racism, the colonialism, the apartheid system was all imported into Palestine from Europe, as it was in other places. The particular case in Palestine is that because Zionism and the State of Israel and Judaism have all been kind of squeezed into this bottle together, there's something very romantic and something very biblical about it, which is why people tend to accept it. People tend to think it's a good thing. There's this romantic story about romantic myth, I should say, about the revival of the Jewish people, the return of the ancient Hebrews to their homeland. Of course, you look at my skin, I don't look anything like ancient Hebrews. I don't think I've ever had an ancestor who lived there. But that's the myth, and people love it, and this is why it's much harder to combat, for example, in many ways, than racism in South Africa or here in the United States, where it doesn't have that beautiful biblical romantic wrapping. So that is why there's a problem in Palestine, and I think once we come to terms with the problem is, then of course we can talk about a solution. And it's not just a breaking down of the actual wall, but it's the breaking down of the barrier, which separates the two spheres where the privileged Israeli Jews live, and the sphere where the Palestinians or the oppressed live. Getting rid of those barriers and allowing for a real democracy with real equality for both sides is really the only solution if we're looking for a solution that includes justice and peace.
What's the best form of resistance to injustice in Palestine? What strategies are the most effective, in your opinion?
It seems over the last, the 7 decades of Palestinian resistance that the Palestinians more often have opted for unarmed resistance than armed resistance. And it also seems that the unarmed resistance, the different forms of unarmed resistance, of peaceful resistance, have been much more effective. What is the best form of resistance, I think, depends on the people who are oppressed and the situation. If we compare it to Algeria, for example, the Algerian resistance was extremely violent and extremely effective. And probably that is why Algeria is free. If we talk about the Israeli occupation in Lebanon, Hezbollah kicked Israel out of Lebanon through a very fierce campaign, armed resistance. So it all depends on the place and the people. The movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The BDS movement has proved itself to be extremely effective, extremely dedicated, extremely principled. It's interesting because in Israel they view what they call it the BDS, which is it's a combination of all the pro-Palestine movements and so forth. The BDS is described as violent, anti-Semitic, bloodthirsty, but there's no proof at all to substantiate that. It is completely non-violent. It is completely principled. It's not anti-Semitic. Many Jewish people, many Israelis participate in it and support it, including myself. But that certainly seems to be one of the strongest and most effective forms of resistance. Here in the United States, Students for Justice in Palestine on campuses, over the last 5-6 years, they have completely managed to change the level of conversation on Palestine in America. In Palestine, the nonviolent resistance, or the popular resistance as it's called, which is every Friday there are marches and protests in the various villages and towns in the West Bank, have proven to be extremely, extremely effective. And you have Nobel laureates from around the world. You have, people like Jimmy Carter and all kinds of, famous people, elders, come there, just to say that they were there, like in Blain and Abi Saleh and all these villages. Every activist that has, feels a sense of activism has to go there to say I was there, and they've gained a great deal of recognition and respect around the world. So that is clearly the way forward, and I think we just need to do more of that and get more support for that for it to to complete the job.
Based on what we read and see, Israeli society itself seems to be changing. It seems to become more and more fractured, and racism seems to extend well beyond the treatment of Palestinians. What is your assessment?
I don't think that it's changing. I think that people are just realizing it now. There are two things that people often forget. Number one, that the state of Israel, the Israeli society, Israeli culture, the politics, everything was built on or immediately after a cruel campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing, at the end of which Palestine was occupied by Israel, or Israel was established in Palestine. So you can't really get much worse than that. But there was a sense of denial, and the sense of, well, look at what these Israelis built. They made the desert bloom. They created this wonderful state with health care for everyone and free education, and they're getting, Nobel Prizes right, left, and center, and what a wonderful place it's become. Completely forgetting the millions of Palestinians who are in refugee camps, completely forgetting the massacres and so forth, and the fact that Palestinians have been completely shut out of this beautiful little thing that the Jews created. That's part of the myth. That's how these things. That's why these things. It was sustained, and that's why people perhaps were able to ignore the reality. Then, at one point, when the Zionist establishment realized that Jews were not coming, they wanted white rich Jews to come, and white rich Jews weren't interested. So they looked around and they said, "Oh, actually, there's some Arab Jews in Arab countries. Maybe we can bring them." So they started this whole campaign where they brought Jews from Iraq, from Yemen, from North Africa, from Syria. And when these Jews arrived, they were sprayed with DDT and sent to camps and then put into manual labor, regardless if they were doctors or teachers or what have you. They figured, well, in several generations, we can whiten them. We can make them look more like me. And it's interesting because for example, they had a very heavy Arabic accent. They listened to Arabic music. They liked Arabic food. They wore Arabic clothes, and all this had to change and was transformed. So much so that even the way Hebrew is spoken they had to change and get rid of their Arabic-sounding accent so their Hebrew would sound more like mine. The clothes, many of these communities were deeply religious communities, and they wore deeply, Jewish clothes that were, of those traditions. They now wear, the ones who are still traditionally and deeply religious, wear the same religious clothes that Jews in Poland wore, because that's acceptable, because that's what Zionism, that's what good Judaism is, and so on. So the racism is very old. It's embedded in Zionism. The Israeli society has been fractured and fragmented from the very beginning. The very first laws that were passed by the Knesset, by the Israeli parliament, were apartheid laws. The very first. It's not something new. It's not something that happened in 1967 or after that. It has nothing to do with Netanyahu or any of these people. This was the very, very foundation of the state of Israel, was as an apartheid and a very violent apartheid state.
You come from a well-known Israeli family. Your grandfather was a Zionist leader. Your father was a military hero. Your sister co-founded the Parent Circle after she lost her daughter in a suicide bombing, and has done some remarkable work about the use of language found in Israeli textbooks. Do all of these family connections, this social status, do they help you in your activist work, or does it make it more challenging?
Yeah, all of these things are helpful in that they somehow amplify my voice. So, being the son of a general seems to be very sexy and a big deal for people, And I was interviewed recently by Israeli TV, who came out here to the U.S. to do a story about the BDS in America. And I was described as the nightmare of the Israeli Hasbara, of the Israeli PR system, because where I come from. And they said to me, don't you feel like they're using you, or they're taking advantage of who you are? I said, of course I want this, they should use me. This is important. If this amplifies my voice, then that's a great thing. Then everybody should know that my grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence, my father was a general, all this stuff. If this amplifies the voice, then that's fine. And now that I've got your attention, by the way, here's what you should do. BDS, BDS, BDS.
So I had mentioned your sister's work on the propaganda found in Israeli textbooks. If you could just very quickly elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, she's the expert, of course, but and I'm a product of that education system. The education system is the propaganda. That is the propaganda machine. From day one, we learn about how this is our land and we returned after 2,000 years or 3,000 years. There's no dissent. There's no questions that we are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. Now we're back and this is ours. There is no dissent on that. This is the starting point. There's no question that anybody that opposes us, that questions our right, is anti-Semitic. So there's no dissent, there's no argument, there's no conversation on that. There's also no question that we always maintain the moral high ground. So even in cases where we committed massacres, and there are some of the massacres of 1948 are actually taught, the 2 or 3 of them. The outcome of the massacre, even though the massacre was bad and wrong, the outcome was positive, because the outcome created fear in the Arabs, and they left, which allowed us to establish a Jewish majority. And we don't need to say this, we all understand that there is nothing more important than creating a Jewish majority. So even though it was not a pleasant thing, the massacre, the outcome was good, so we move on. There was this horrible, bloodthirsty military commando unit that was commanded by Ariel Sharon that would go into Gaza and commit terrible massacres. So there were pictures of them in the textbook coming out as heroes, with dust in their hair and the guns, this sense of heroism. And they just came out of killing people who not only don't have weapons, they don't have food, But the sense was that these are our guys, they're heroes, and if they did it, they must know why. There must be a good reason, because they wouldn't do that otherwise. This is embedded in the education system, in the textbooks, in the geography book, in everything you look at. And at age 18, we're given a gun, and we're told, now see those people over there, these anti-Semitics, they're trying to kick us out. And it's our job, it rests on our shoulders to be sure that there's not another Holocaust, or there's not another exile like in biblical days, and so on and so forth. That's the propaganda, and that's really the gist of the education system.
Just quickly, if you could talk a little bit about Gaza, and then if you could talk a little bit about the hunger strikes that are happening in the prison population.
These are 2 issues that are so monumental, but because the segregation is so deep, not only the segregation on the ground in Palestine, the segregation in the media, the segregation in people's minds about this issue, that they're not discussed, It's like trying to ignore the sun on a sunny day. It's incredible how they manage to do this. Gaza is a concentration camp that has close to 2 million people. It's 5 minutes away from Israeli towns where people have everything they need. They live a good life, a developed, industrialized kind of lifestyle. There's no question that there's always going to be plenty of electricity and clean water and access to healthcare and everything else you need. Whereas in Gaza, 90% of the water is unfit for drinking. If a child has an ear infection, there's no access to antibiotics. I mean, can you imagine that? The pain. Never mind the massive amounts of bombing. Obama just confirmed giving Israel $38 billion over the next 10 years. Why does a fully developed, industrialized nation need foreign aid? And to that amount, it is criminal beyond belief, and it is really, if we look, for example, at international law, the United States is complicit in genocide by giving Israel this money, because genocide is the only way to describe what is happening in Palestine. The other issue you raised, the issue of the Palestinian prisoners. Israel has held for a very long time thousands of Palestinian prisoners who they call terrorists, but even according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of them have never been engaged in violence. So we're talking about political prisoners. Now Israel has also what is called administrative detention, where they can arrest anyone at any time for any length of time without charge. And over the last several years, there have been several detainees who have gone on hunger strike. There are several right now that are on hunger strike. They've passed 50, 60, 70 days. The fact that they're still alive is miraculous. And Israel doesn't budge until the last minute, until they are really moments from death. Somehow they reach a compromise. And I know several Palestinian attorneys who represent them and try to work with, and they represent them in talking to the Israeli government. And talk about the selflessness, talk about the ultimate sacrifice. There is nothing more painful than that slow death of a hunger strike. There is nothing. We're not talking about people who decide not to eat for a day or two. We're talking about a hunger strike where system after system the body collapses, and often it is irreversible. We're talking about they get to a point where the eyes no longer work, the liver no longer doesn't function. I mean, major injury to their own. And I think this, more than anything, demonstrates the willingness to resist without engaging in violence, which has been really the spirit of the Palestinian resistance from the very, very beginning. And these guys, if they weren't Palestinians, they would be heralded around the world as heroes, as major heroes. But Palestinians are not permitted to be heroes. They're only allowed to be either victims or terrorists. And that's the reality, and that's why it's being ignored.